Finally, it is my great pleasure to welcome presenter, journalist and campaigner Mariella Frostrup. In 2018, she made her acclaimed BBC programme, The Truth About the Menopause, and then wrote the best-selling book, of which I was fortunate enough to be co-author, Cracking The Menopause, which was published in 2021. Last year, she co-founded the campaign group Menopause Mandate, of which she is chair. She has spoken and written widely about the importance of menopause education, access to treatment, and informed choice. Currently helming her own afternoon show on Times Radio, Mariella was recently named one of Vogue's 25 most influential women in the UK. Her wit, passion, and quick mind are legendary. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Alice. Wit, what else did you say? Look, brain fog. I'm afraid that I was going to say fresh from my radio show, but that would be the wrong description of how you feel after 2 hours of live radio in 3 days so far. I've just enough, one more to go. Anyway, I'm absolutely delighted to be here in such excellent company. I'm not sure what the collective noun is for business people, a success, a drive, a host, I'm not sure. But anyway, I'm delighted to see you all here. And I was just listening to this session here. I mean, such a fascinating panel, and just listening to people speak with such passion and eloquence about women's health. I think we all have to remember how unusual just that very thing is, and how far we've come already. It looks like it's been an incredible afternoon, chock full of informative talk from an array of speakers about an array of topics that were, ironically, considered unspeakable. As a teenage girl who used to hide her tampons under a cereal box when I'd go to the shops to get them, I didn't even need the cereal, so that no one knew I was having a period, to find myself on this platform and deeply immersed in the issues being discussed feels like the great world has really spun, to paraphrase the wonderful author Colin McCann. If you haven't read his book, Let the Great World Spin, may I highly recommend it. Menstruation, menopause, and the workplace are very much the topics du jour. I can only congratulate the BSI on their excellent standard and full-on recognition of the zeitgeist. The standard has already had such an impact and promises to have far more over the following years. Standards aren't necessarily what we expect in the world at the moment, exposed as we are to the incessant lowering of them in so many aspects of our lives, from the political world to the online world, where anonymous voices create Salem-like conditions without a shred of what used to be called common decency. So, what a pleasure it is to be here at an institution devoted to creating positive standards that can be referred to and measured, and ultimately will lead to making our lives better. Embarrassingly, until this year, sorry, my glasses have stretched because I keep wearing them on my head, I keep sliding down my nose. Embarrassingly, until this year, I was woefully ignorant of the BSI's work, and didn't really realize it was possible to create a standard for the workplace that could play a key role in embracing women's biological journey, instead of sidelining it as a pesky stumbling block to continuing business as usual from century to century, the long, linear, hierarchical progression best suited to the male of the species. I didn't understand that we needed a standard for the workplace. I just knew full well that we didn't have legislation protecting those of us whose possession of ovaries, wombs, and vaginas made our working lives different and far less linear, perhaps, to the experience of the other half of the population. Why it still comes as a surprise that a different arrangement of hormones means just that, not demanding or difficult, but different, I don't know. But there are unquestionably still many people who look upon 50% of the population's biology as inferior and irritating. So I can't quite emphasize my joy enough at the excellent, beautifully researched and perfectly presented new standard, Menstruation, Menstrual Health and Menopause in the Workplace, launched with a fanfare of excitement, news stories and general joy this year, deserving of all of them. I've read it from start to finish, though I won't be taking questions, thank you. But I can assure you that it is a masterpiece, and I've read a few of those. There is, I've recently learned, a standard for everything. There are standards for all manner of sectors, food and retail, energy, healthcare, manufacturing. The list goes on. I'll try not to. Standards are the structure around which our workplaces and economy are woven and built. And as I say, I had no fully formed understanding of their imperative contribution to our lives until we spoke with BSI before our last menopause mandate meeting in Parliament, and were fortunate enough to have a preview of the current one. Looking on the BSI website, I read that new standards are developed when there's a market or organizational need for one. From an employer point of view, a standard can help a business to succeed, reduce costs, boost growth, and, which is really the end game of any business, help companies become more profitable. In the case of menstruation, menopause, and the associated joys, this is the sort of clear, blue sky thinking and policy that we desperately need. I can't help wondering why the entire governing of the UK isn't handed over to the BSI. Let's just get it over and done with. Maybe they're just too professional. The aim of this particular standard is for organisations to do more for those employees suffering from the impact of a totally natural biological progression from menstruation to menopause, with all the stuff imperative to our survival as a species in between, including, but not primarily focused on fertility, which has been the case for far too long. The standard can be used, if necessary, to point employers in the right direction, but really, it's to enable everyone to do better, to make life easier, and to facilitate employees to continue working. As I say, I'm not going to deconstruct the whole thing. You can all do that at your own leisure, but I will flag up a few excellent points. It tackles myths, reminds employers that they should recognize that there are racial and ethnic disparities in experiences, something that's coming to the fore more and more at the moment and needs to be highlighted by all of us. And it gives clear and very practical suggestions for employers, many of whom do come up with baffled looks on their faces, just going, we really want to do something, but we don't know what to do. Well, here's a clue, more than a clue, a direction. The emphasis is on education, awareness, and an individual approach that considers the diversity of experiences. I'd like to think that it's going to be launched on a global scale. One of the great rewards of the work we've been doing recently on menopause is that many other countries are looking to the UK for inspiration. How wonderful to think that we might be global leaders in something. If only there had been a standard in place throughout my personal, and I absolutely hate this word and I hate using it, but it just felt appropriate here, journey. I can't think of a better word in a way, because that's what we all go through. Though I say that, it's not really been so much of a progressive journey as a slow dawning realization that awareness about women's health has been so appalling that even I, a dedicated campaigner for women's rights my entire career, my entire life, seem to have overlooked parts of it, as demonstrated by my lack of knowledge about my own menopause. It's the biggest elephant in the room ever, or at least it was a few years ago, and hopefully gradually is dissipating. The biological experience of women, including trans men and those who identify as non-binary, affects over half the population, 52% of the population. As such, it surely ought to be an instant number one, or maybe we'll put up with number two priority on any government or employer healthcare agenda. Rather, it's been the case that our health has relied for far too long on the idea that the possession of certain physical attributes means that we are lesser versions of humanity. The spare rib theory has haunted us down the ages, with the assumption that we're fashioned from a cast-off bit of male anatomy and our health needs are one and the same, or, where they diversify, irrelevant. I absolutely can't myself complain about menstruation or indeed pregnancy on a personal level. The only downside to pregnancy for me was my horrific craving for sardines. My husband would come home and find me inside the fridge door, like cramming another load of them. And I mean, that's not physically unpleasant, I suppose, unless you're trying to kiss me afterwards. But our boss at the BBC did, I remembered when I was jotting down notes for this speech, tell me when I returned to work 12 weeks after my second child that my breastfeeding schedule was inconveniencing the production of the culture show. I'm very happy to say that that would never happen now. I think such accepted misogyny is no longer tolerated. But I have to admit that my own menopause hit me like a truck, an invisible one, as I had no idea at all, utterly clueless about what was coming down the track at me. I mean, it's shameful. It feels shameful now because things have already started to move on, which is a really positive thing. But, you know, I went through 2 years of low-level anxiety, high-level insomnia, completely oblivious to the idea that this complete change of character and alarming struggle to cope might have anything to do at all with midlife hormones. Menopause was something you didn't talk about, and you knew you had it if you had a hot flush or 10. And that was it. So it just never even occurred to me. I suffered from really horrendous anxiety, but completely irrational. You know, I'd be as agitated about, you know, whether I'd ordered tomatoes on the supermarket list to whether we could achieve world peace or whether I was getting home in time to relieve the babysitter. I mean, everything was at a completely heightened level, and I just had no clue about what was happening. Incidentally, back then, just a few years ago, I definitely didn't have the confidence or indeed the knowledge of the subject to be standing here. My 50th birthday was a particularly muted event as I just couldn't face large crowds at all. My 60th, I'm happy to report, just a few months ago was a rather raucous weekend with dear friends, probably, yeah, embarrassingly raucous, really, with dear friends and family from which I emerged exhausted but very happy. But back to perimenopause. I mean, my temper was horrific. I suspect my husband would gladly testify to this, but he says all of it was horrific. Pregnancy, everything really, getting me pregnant in the first place. I mean, it's a sort of constant. It's nice to have a constant in life, isn't it? But alongside the kind of temper was the self-loathing and the confusion because I didn't know what it was. So I just thought I was actually falling apart and also that I'd lost myself. I just couldn't find myself in this morass of hormonal activity as I understand it now. I'll gloss over the road to diagnosis, but as is the case for so many women, it was a bit of a postcode and also bank balance lottery. I ended up going private in order to just get some answers, and I was very, very lucky to be able to do that. I know there are lots of people who go private and don't get their answers, so there is no, one size fits all on that. But suffice it to say, there's a happy ending, a sort of happy HRT packed ending for me, anyway. Did my career suffer? Probably yes. But like every other woman on the planet, until very recently, there's only been the niggling sensation of feeling below par and trying to mitigate and, most importantly, disguise what pesky hormones are putting us through. Instead of shaping the working world around our imperative presence in it, and I mean economically imperative presence in it, we're forced to try and find space for our inclusion, and that has until recently depended on maintaining a male standard. And that's really the issue, because it's a playing field full of lumps and bumps that only one half of the population have to navigate, and until recently appeared to the other a handicap they hoped we'd find a way through whilst keeping our noses firmly to the grindstone. So like most other women, I just got on with it. We've been bred to be stoic, to accept hormones and hormonal turbulence as our lot, and to pretend, actually, that our hormones don't really exist, especially when it comes to work. I struggled horrendously, brain fog and I can't even say it, irritability aren't ideal when you're on live radio. Neither is lack of sleep. But in our book, Cracking the Menopause, we wrote about menopause being the third shift, something to be got on with alongside work and home life, the only ones to really suffer being, of course, women. Had there been the awareness of these life stages that there are today, a mere decade on, then perhaps I might have recognized my symptoms better, sooner, been supported when they were at their most debilitating, and navigated my way through this inevitable biological phase. Most importantly, it could have been a shared experience to laugh about with friends over a glass of wine, recklessly ignoring the bad night's sleep that would ensure. And maybe I would have felt confident enough even to mention it at work. Of course, being me, once I had my hands on a pocket full of HRT, which coincided with the NICE guidelines, God bless the NICE guidelines, if only they were employed more often. So it coincided with the NICE guidelines being rewritten. I started to write and talk and actually make a documentary about menopause and why it's so badly needed, demystifying. But all the elements of our biology, from menstruation to menopause, have been seen as an inconvenience in the workplace. Periods, pregnancy and associated complications, pregnancy loss, fertility problems, fibroids, endometriosis, and PMDD, all until very recently swept under the carpet. And all of this because it's not been of interest to those who've historically written the medical textbooks and made the rules. It's effectively a gaslighting and a cover-up bigger than the fact that there was room on that floating door in Titanic. A good example, perhaps, of how it all started is back in 300 BC when Aristotle, the revered Greek philosopher, we might question why, suggested that the reason we have periods is because we are colder than men, as well as less active, positively lazy. So we need to get rid of our excess blood. I'd be tempted to scrutinize Aristotle's pioneering philosophies with a stern eye if they're anything like as flawed as his description of women's bodies. Periods, according to Aristotle, are the process of getting rid of this excess blood, hence the issue when menstruation stops. Whereas men, of course, are constructed with perfect balance and just the right amount of heat and blood, which they make into semen, for which we're incredibly grateful. This idea of menstruation as a cleansing process of some sort or other endures for almost another 2,000 years. Incidentally, just in case you can't get enough of Aristotle, he thought of women as mutilated males. He may have kicked off the theme of women being little more than an embarrassing biological footnote, but things are only just changing now, and medical misogyny, I'm afraid, still remains rife. Obviously, the presence of ovaries and wombs doesn't make us second best. Just listen to that sentence and how ludicrous it sounds. Nor are they impediments that need to be worked around. Our biology is what should be shaping business as we go forward. That means that working practice must fundamentally change to stop the brain drain that happens along the route of the female biological journey that just happens to coincide with our working lives. And that's what I see starting very gradually to happen now. The realization that our biology isn't something to apologize for, but accepted as a part of our lives with time and research devoted to how we can be at our individual best and supported when it comes to the occasional trial and tribulation. As I emerged from my own experience of menopause, an educated journalist considering myself to be well informed and aware of my body, I was really, really shocked at the dearth of general knowledge about the subject, and I remain so. I mean, if only my company had had a standard, my various companies, I mean, I don't mean my various companies, I'm not a magnet, but the various companies I work for, then my experience might have been preempted, and now that's true for so many women out there. Now we have the possibility of being understood what might happen, and the possibilities of adjustments being made that very simply just make working life better. And this is right across the board as well. I mean, it's not just in the area of menopause, and that's what I feel so passionately about today, because working in the menopause sphere has only highlighted for me the fact that, right across the board, women's biology is seen as something that we have to apologize and make up for, that we need mentors to help us through, and so on. And what we've entirely failed to grasp is that we are 50 to 52% of the population, and absolutely imperative to the future of our world. And so actually it's a woman-shaped space that we want in the working world. And it's a completely different shaped space to the linear hierarchical one that I referred to earlier that men have created, because their bodies work differently. It's not as an act of, punishment to us, but I think it's just what's happened to evolve. And that's what we need to change today. It's not minor adjustments and slight tweaks. Who'd ever have thought that we'd be working, flexi hours and flexi days until the pandemic came along and actually opened the world's eyes to the fact that there were different ways to do things. And that's what we need to continue with today. I interviewed just a few weeks ago on my program on Times Radio, a young woman, I think just in her early 30s when I spoke to her about her endometriosis. And what she described was it was spellbinding radio, because it was so horrifically unjust. 10 years of excruciating agony that was repeatedly dismissed as just painful periods, and that she needed to just suck it up and get on with it. She had to pretend she was fine until a decade later she really wasn't. By the time she was diagnosed, after a whole 10 years of humiliation and career setbacks, any of you who've actually found yourselves calling up a boss and saying to them, "I'm sorry, I've got bad period pain," will know that you're treated often as though you're calling up with a hangover, or it's a bare excuse for something else that you've been up to. And this was something that this woman had endured for over a decade. And so by the time she was diagnosed, after this decade of humiliation and career setbacks, her condition was critical, because endometriosis obviously gets worse. Her career was in tatters and her fertility entirely gone. Her story doesn't just highlight the agonies that we might face, but also the patronizing, I'm afraid, and unhelpful societal attitude that covers the female situation. As I just mentioned, it's seen as flaky, shameful even, to call your boss and say you're having a bad period, or indeed that you haven't slept because of menopausal symptoms. And both those things just add extra stress to an already stressful situation. Here are some statistics to further show the need for this standard and support for us. 1.5 million British women suffer from endometriosis. As many as 30% have moderate to severe PMS, and 5 to 8% have PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. In addition, according to Women's Health Concern, 1 in 3 describe their period as heavy, and at least 1 in 20 women speak to their doctor every year about this problem, as did the young woman that I spoke to. According to the brilliant Fawcett Society report from last year, Menopause in the Workplace, 1 in 10 women who work during the menopause have left their job due to menopause symptoms. 8 out of 10 say their employer hasn't shared information, trained staff, or put in place a menopause absence policy. When it comes to menstruation, this all makes just dismal listening. And also, worryingly, as I do now go often to different companies to give talks, I'm often accosted in the toilet afterwards, something that began after I made the menopause documentary and has continued ever since. The toilet's now no longer a refuge for me, but somewhere where I have some of my most heated discussions. But I often find myself in these companies, and having listened to, various bosses describe the wonderful policies that they have in place, the menopause mentor, etc., and then have women tell me that actually the culture is completely different and that nothing has changed. And I'm really sad to say that I think perhaps meno-washing might be a new inclusion in the Oxford Dictionary next year. The workplace, as I've said, is designed in a linear, hierarchical and patriarchal fashion. No wonder after hundreds and indeed thousands of years. It's not because we're being actively discriminated against, but because the female form is such a relatively new presence in every walk of working life. If you want women and trans women and non-binary individuals to be involved and to stay involved, and frankly, if you want your business to be successful, you don't have a choice, and you want them to give their best and to actively aid your company's success, then it's got to be a sea change, not just little changes, as I said, and tweaks, but an absolute acceptance that the world that we live in now has been constructed around one half of humanity and not around the other. And that is what needs to change, a tsunami of change from the ground up. What I rejoice over, and the BSI standard is an excellent example of this, is the fact that menstruation, pregnancy and menopause are finally, in 2023, accepted as not just an inconvenience, but a fact, and one to be openly and enthusiastically celebrated for its imperative to the future of our species, not just as something that stops us being as biologically perfect, apparently, as the male of the species. And I think it's really, really great that so many of you are here today highlighting the fact that businesses are finally taking responsibility for the health of half of their employees. The amount of successful people taking a stand, using their voices is increasing daily. All of you here today, my menopause sisters, including Davina, Penny Lancaster, Lisa Snowden, Michelle Griffith-Robinson and Gabby Logan. Of course, my co-author, Alice, whose safe hands you've been in all day. There's also Daisy Network, raising awareness of premature ovarian insufficiency. And of course, Davina McCall and Kate Muir have recently spoken out about contraception as well and its failings. I am personally incredibly proud to have been a part of the discussions and as chair of Menopause Mandate pioneered some of them. I'm just as excited also to have the conversation opened up even further, and along with colleagues such as BSI, it looks set to continue, improve, and perhaps get even louder. But if you leave this room with anything from what I've said, I really think it has to be a wholesale revolution. The times have come for change, and it really needs to happen now. It's a completely ridiculous, unsustainable, and I think unjust situation still, and we need to change that. Each and every one of us can play a part. Thank you.
Right.
Isn't she a wonder?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mariella. And thank you to everyone who has been here, who's working towards a more inclusive and supportive working environment. And finally, I'm going to hand you over to the excellent Anne Hayes for her closing words, after which you're invited to join us for drinks. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice. Tough act to follow, just so we all know. So what I'm going to say is that I believe the revolution has started. I believe that this standard is a great tool for you. I also believe that there are drinks outside, so I'm not going to go on too long. There are three things that really struck me today are sort of the role of this standard is to normalise the conversation. So there's a document out there that you can now take into your workplaces, you can talk to people about it, and actually you have a starting place in order to have that conversation. The other key thing is not one size fits all. What might work for our organisation might not work in another organisation, and I think that's come up a number of times in the questions, and I really can't emphasise that enough. The standard doesn't say you have to do one thing, it gives you a whole plethora of ideas and things that you can use about it. And finally, there's been a lot of questions today around, or comments today around people leaving the workforce early, not necessarily of their own choice, but because they feel it's impossible to go on. And I'm actually, coincidentally, really proud to say that today BSI have launched some research that we've done globally on the second glass ceiling and why women leave the workplace. And so there should be a QR code that will appear in a minute, and if it doesn't, we'll make sure you get it, so that you can download that report, because all of this information, which is validated information, is out there to help that conversation that you can take back to your businesses. Our board constantly asks me about what is the call of action that you're giving people. So my call of action to you is to say, you need to go out of here and you need to tell at least 5 people about this standard, and you need to tell them that they need to download it. It's free to download. We will take on board comments, or at least the team at BSI will, not me personally, but we will all gather together and take on board the comments. We want to make it a success. We believe we have a real opportunity to make a difference, and having you all here today and online just makes that easier for us. So thank you for your attention. Please stay for a drink and some food. And we really appreciate the efforts you've all made to get here today, because I know transport and schools situations has made that difficult. So thank you very much. And thank you to Alice, actually. Huge thank you.